And I'm going to hand over the mic to Alexi Kukuljevic to host this panel, moderate this panel. Alexi Kukuljevic is an artist and philosopher and also teacher here at the art theory department. So I'm very happy that you're moderating this panel with Mattin and Kerstin Stakemeier. Looking forward. After this, we're going to have a very small in-between break for the next person. And before the bigger plenary session, we're going to have a coffee break. So it's going to be a little bit compact so that we make it to the plenary session. And yeah, nice that you are here. Alexi, please.
Great. Thank you, Sofia. It's a pleasure to moderate this panel. So let me just introduce Kerstin Stakemeier and then Mattin, and I think we'll go in that order. First Kerstin, then Mattin. Oh, that's right. Sorry, can you please come to the front? I apologize. Yeah. Sorry about that. So Kerstin Stakemeier is professor of art theory at the University of Fine Arts in Nuremberg. She was also a close collaborator of Marina's. They co-authored the book Reproducing Autonomy, Work, Money, Crisis in Contemporary Art that was published with Mute in 2016. And they were working on a second book, a version of which will, if I understand correctly, will be coming out next year, titled Marina's Cues, Infrastructures of Disalienation. And in general, her work addresses the unfolding horrors of modernity, the critique of political economy, and the European legacy of colonization. Mattin is an artist, musician, and theorist, working conceptually with performance and improvisation. He is an associate professor at Tromsø Academy of Arts at the Arctic University of Norway, and the author of, that is a university, by the way, and the author of Social Dissonance, published with Urbanomic in 2022. And his work really centers on the problem of alienation, which is, he sort of sets at the core of his artistic and theoretical practice. And I think the question of alienation and disalienation will be sort of the general sort of thematic of this panel. So welcome, and we'll start with Kerstin. Thank you.
So the first thing I have to say is I'll not really talk about disalienation, because I wrote the abstract and then I wrote the text and something happened in between. Parts of it was this conference. So let's see. First of all, thank you, of course, also from me. Thank you to Danny and Roseanne for doing this, and Sofia and Annette for facilitating and doing this, and everybody being here. And I'm really enthusiastic about this because so many of the papers really not fall into line with one another, but rather there are those ruptures and questions, but they're all posed in a very solidary way. So it's not so much an academic conference where everybody goes like, this is me and this is not you. But it's more about, can we get over this and think about communion? So I'm gonna also try and think about communion, but I need my glasses for that. So here. Yeah, the title remained the same, just not what I'm speaking about. Let me chink. So I'm going to start with something that was already here, namely the same quote that Danny used from Marina's text on Dora Budor's work, which I will read out loud to start. I would suggest that art's heavily caveated microhistory of form involves a miss or non-recognition of another means, a path of errancy when it comes to form and its wavering possibilities. This could be called the metamorphosis of gaps. Gaps rather than voids, for instance, because a void already hypostasizes its emptiness as completeness, whereas a gap subsists in relation. A void is thus always aspiring to the status of an object, whereas a gap is cut into time or language. It's a spacing that telescopes in and out of an infrastructure and may give an impetus for connecting beyond it. We can think of the gap as the errancy of a system, the negativity at the core of its positive appearance or structural integrity in the world. It's the manner in which these gaps are produced, whether by cuts or other means, that allows us to think of them as constitutive, as models for thought or a speculative approach to infrastructure. So, if these gaps are the origins of our speculation, if they are constitutive of our heretic sense and senses, the question how gaps are produced is anything but banal. And we have been discussing, I feel like, exactly that backwards and forwards more and more throughout the last 2 days. So here's the negativity that does not abide by its modernist self-isolation, and to indeed ground our materialism, our realism, and our fantasies of communion within such gaps that cut into time or language, it opens up what is transgressive and what is self-transgressive to becoming speculative, shared. This is what I'm after in testing out Marina's infrastructural web. I want it to be at the core of its positive appearance or structural integrity in the world. It's the manner in which these gaps are produced, whether by cuts or other means, that allows us to think of them as constitutive, as models for thought or a speculative approach to infrastructure. So, if these gaps are the origins of our speculation, if they are constitutive of our heretic sense and senses, the question how gaps are produced is anything but banal. And we have been discussing, I feel like, exactly that backwards and forwards more and more throughout the last 2 days. So here's the negativity that does not abide by its modernist self-isolation, and to indeed ground our materialism, our realism, and our fantasies of communion within such gaps that cut into time or language, it opens up what is transgressive and what is self-transgressive to becoming speculative, shared. This is what I'm after in testing out Marina's infrastructural web. I want to see how the gaps can leverage communions out of isolation, cut threads of disalienation into alienation. Well, here's the word, but turn transgression into degenerations, contradict secularization, and desecularize our love, our fantasy into living communion. So I'm going to start with some caveats. There's a string of homological narratives that shed light on how we ended up right here, which all align in their generation of property as the toxic solvent, the jinxed key to all vitality. Narratives of colonization, of secularization, of alienation, of capitalization. There are more. But these are the ones that have come to align in my horizon. They cohere in making all of our properties, by which I mean they make our privacies. The more of them we thread together, the more they come into view as cutting through the sense and senses of our bodies, partitioning them at the skin line, setting them up for their incessant reproduction. The cuts and gaps that Marina threads her materialism out of, they are negatives to those narratives. They rip the languages. They sense the senses of our colonial, secular, capital reproduction through our alienation. And the cuts and gaps, they are not necessarily pretty. What leaks out of them is also a degenerative speculation, one that has not congealed into a void or anything else, but one that is cut loose for now. So let's say, best case, the gaps are signatures of vitality, a form miraculously synthetic, in a non-identical fashion, upsetting imperial lines of origination, cutting through expansive reproduction. Best case, gaps are origins. Hooks for a disalienating materialism, hook lines, uncharacteristic needs. And worst case, because there is a worst case to cutting into reproduction, worst case, they turn into reserves of reinforcement, violent parades of congealed form, fortifying imperial identities and re-narrating the promises of colonial origin as a lineage of assurances. Worst case, gaps are origins. Models for a lethal alienation. Reprise, secular desires. So this is where infrastructure is speculative, where Marina does not hold materialism in originating in the antagonism of something lively, labor, and something dead, capital, but in understanding infrastructure as something that is generated from an inconsistency, a gap, a cut, a leap that runs through both, as we heard, like, for example, in Andrea's paper earlier today. And it cuts through both the living and the dead. It is, in other words, its original heteronomy that makes infrastructural materialism speculative. It is never unprecedented. It originates unfailingly in breaks within reproductive negativity. It oozes out of autopoietic failings as much as out of systemic dysfunction. Gaps, originally, are not just us making more sense, but less. Because sense needs a life. Antagonisms become metabolic infrastructures for training gap senses instead of reifying infrastructural non-identity into revolutionary emblems that appear untouched by their own negative and necessarily negative origin. And again, that was discussed on the panel just before. So, recently, in returning to the history of the Popular Front from the mid-30s onwards, trying to get a sense of how to engage in some realism now, I came across a lot of GDR art history. And really, I'm a fan. I might actually become a GDR art historian. Now seems to be a really good time for it. Why exactly? For one, the Peasant Wars, and I mean, this is like, isn't this the best book cover that was ever made? Anyway. So for one, the Peasant Wars, which this book is about, appears to me to be a much better place to start contemporary history from than Romanticism, starting from the communal census, the spontaneous forms of a mass rebellion of needs, rather than from the outstanding formulations of isolated sentiments of modern alienation. Or more precisely, reading the latter through the former. GDR art history reads like an inverted history of modern life in which 8 people author collectives write 700-page volumes with very, very modest titles, like, where are you? Here. Modest titles like Ästhetik der Kunst. Try Googling that book, seriously. So, and like Ästhetik der Kunst very casually starts by stating, for decades, the consensus was art is not autonomous, but heteronymous. This is what they're doing. So then they look at the genesis of art's autonomy as an exemplary narrative of a dematerialization of social freedom since the Peasant Wars. Or in one of the issues of the 100-part pamphlet series, Zur Kritik der bürgerlichen Ideologie, dedicated to Theodor W. Adorno, Peter Reiche concludes that Adorno's main method for constituting the future is that of the mirror reflex, which is Adorno's word. The guarantor of the future appears to be the truth as concept and as property, wherein the truth is being manufactured by the negation of current reality, end quote. Again, I cannot but agree. In the words of Marina's introductory quote, and in the spirit of critically privileging autonomy, Adorno construes a void instead of a gap, an owned negativity. The general insistence on the material historicity of truth that runs through GDR art history, its emphasis on the truth's inescapable falsification by ownership, it has a strong penchant for finitude that I find extremely relatable today. As soon as negativity loses the vitalism it imports from its compromised origins without metabolizing it, without communizing it, it becomes a void. Allegorically beautiful, maybe, but dead, definitely. An institution. Here is where it meets Marina's perpetual strings of synthesis, which Danny spoke about on the first evening. Her negativities never came to a hold. They remained stretched, drawing in and out contemporaneities as much as pasts. When being invested in life's historical origin, nothing can die. Not yet. Would have been nice to drop GDR art history, but let's face it, there is a need for it. In narrating realism out of the peasant wars of the early 16th century, GDR art history needed to engage art as an element of subsistence, an infrastructural need, the lives and death of which its art history narrates. In that sense, GDR art history sees autonomous art and modern history more generally as a form of harm, a perspective of unending terminal care. And care is terminal. Marina wasn't into it, or such, she wasn't into it, because needs need gap lives. But like the pirate care thing Andreas mentioned earlier might be a solution for that. And Frederick Jameson, who I will say something about the pictures. Frederick Jameson appears to have had homological hopes for realism, positing that it must begin with the promise of immediacy, of a contact with a unique and contingent reality, a specific and unpredictable conjuncture, a subject's intense singularity, the unmistakable flavor of a region, an unexpected historical event. He goes all out, sorry, this is why I use the quote, yes. But only 6 lines later, he concedes that realism is but a hiccup in reification. A postponement of reification until not so much further notice still. That's life. But then he goes all Bildungsroman, and I'm out. Returning to GDR art history and to Marina, who both appear distinctively less Leninist. Gudrun Klatt, who worked an awful lot with Heiner Müller, offers a series of more qualified realist gaps and hiccups in the works of Lifshitz, Lukács, Lunacharsky, Bloch, and Benjamin. Arguably, the Goethes and Schillers of realism. However, Klatt has no interest in qualifying any of them as realists, but instead qualifies an unaligned series of realisms within their work, which, once again, defies the autonomy-negativity void complex in following lifelines, infrastructural speculations like that of Ernst Bloch, who, at the onset of the realism debate in 1934, offered, and I quote, the non-simultaneity of many impulses, reactions, and reaction foundations as the, as the weather vane within the coming popular front, end quote. I love the idea of a weather vane, even though I cannot pronounce it. I love the idea of a weather vane of non-simultaneities, but when one thinks of where the wind blows right now, the imminent horror of the realism of gaps, the materialism of gaps is implied in now, becomes very apparent. The popular front drifted into Bildungsroman. The need for vitality that Marina's speculative materialism from gaps carries, the commitments to staying clear of voids and synthesizing away, to spurning the security that their mirror reflexes hold on to, its speculative core knows of its impending death. It knows of the pressing need to thicken into what Danny, in Wound Building, in a text on L.J. Jeschke's work, called the necessity to feel passionate for bad options, which Marina always did. Her synthesis thickened into communions, and as banal as that is, the commitment to the thickening of gaps into the weather vane tendencies of bad options seems to be what the popular front was all about, and is all about, that death is happening while we are unpopular, that death is systematic to reproduction while we are unpopular, that the gaps in reproduction need a popular life. That is what Bloch argued with Lukács over in the 1930s, positing expressionism as the realism of their non-simultaneity. I'll do it again. That is what Bloch argued with Lukács over in the 1930s, positing expressionism as the realism of their non-simultaneous, their gapped fascist time. It is Bloch trying to keep the bad options moving, to not foreclose a horizon of good options, and to not let the bad options congeal into a form of negativity that hibernates within the tidal sways of liberalism and illiberalism, which is what the DDR art historian accused Adorno of. Fascism thickened in the 30s and it thickens now, but it was and is within reproduction all along. The genocidal death cult inherent to the narratives I started from, colonization, secularization, alienation, capitalization. And where I'm aiming at is that this is an aesthetic question. That is, if we entertain a largely optimistic sense of what is aesthetic, needfully so. It needs our senses because it is our senses that are gaped into their genuinely modern reproduction within what Talal Assad, in Formations of the Secular, identifies, and I quote him, as proliferating technologies of production, warfare, travel, entertainment, and medicine that generate new experiences of space and time, of cruelty and health, of consumption and knowledge. In other words, secularization. Assad argues that what was perceived and articulated as the disenchantment of experience in the 18th century manifested in the cutting. Okay, sorry. Did I do something wrong here? No, sorry. No. Assad argues that what was perceived and articulated as the disenchantment of experience in the 18th century manifested in the cutting of senses out of bodies, implying a direct access to reality, a stripping away of myth, magic, and the sacred as a salient feature of the modern epoch. End quote. Disenchantment cut through sensual connectivities. Think peasant wars, but also think Hildegard von Bingen. Think Ottoman troubadour poetry. Old enchantment is a bad option, sure, but it sadly cannot be dropped either, at least not now. Not when disenchantment, when secularization has congealed into yet another epoch of crusades, into genocidal reason. So GDR art history and my speculative plea against secularization, they start matching inadvertently because the present we inhabit forces them into the very same space, a popular front of senses. This is why the gap I'm interested in is aesthetic, because where enchantment went, and again Assad argues as much, is where enchantment went is art, is literature, to be precise, the mass press that was coincidental with Romanticism, the institutionalization of the modern novel and its imaginary replacement of a living sensual communion. A Bildungsroman for the citizen to read and alienatedly mull over. This is why Devon Foy and me are obsessed with what Lou Mattin called the fantasies of the people, and she added, historically there were never any others. Because that is still true. The living enchantment of the senses that religion had offered, but that did not stop there, but that had been reused and repurposed, reoriginated and shaped into rebellions, peasant wars. So really, to hell with secularization, because it has meanwhile congealed into Christianity, translating itself meticulously and missionarily into each and every living body of capitalization and registering forms of intranslatability, starting with Quran always, as crusade-worthy. So, what is the popular front of senses? No Bildungsroman, but literature and art that needs to be entering into the life that is dying. And that means all of us. What is art in the times of a Christian death cult? Impossible. Reproduction. Well, later in that very essay on boudoir that I started from, Marina writes, Klaus Teweleit's singular book Male Fantasies spelled out the seethers as he read the journals and propaganda of the pre-World War II German fascist militias with the horror of fluids, filth, and communist women, while more recently the poet and writer Danny Hayward revived this inquiry in his reflections on gaplessness and the block as the body ideal of the far-right affect. Marina quotes Danny, fascists imagine themselves as blocks because the idea that their personalities might contain holes or gaps is unbearable to them. They need to be impenetrable, complete, positively constipated with their own heroism, end quote. The popular front of senses against a gapless life. Thank you, Marina, and thank you, Danny. The gaps of materialism, they originate from that core negativity around which, as Marina writes, the structural integrity of the world is built. the speculative infrastructures of rebellion, the popular front of senses. It is aligned against the properties of alienation within a poverty that renders it unimmunized against the secular organization of finitude, or less prosaic, it renders it unimmunized against death and how it is distributed. It needs synthesis. It needs senses to thicken into infrastructures, shared sense and senses together. So Marina's infrastructural critique is Bloch's expressionism, is Peter Gorson's subjectless realism, is Samuel Delaney's uncharacteristic fetishism. And I will not make it all the way to Delaney and Gorson today, but Nana said yesterday that she was also looking at Gorson, so here he is. And with some of the Nuremberg students who are also here, I read Delaney's aversion, perversion, diversion, which is brilliant, just now, so here that is. And also what Marina's gap life of infrastructural materialism leads me to in my own work is something like a degenerate sex within a popular front of senses. And the popular front of senses was the title of a workshop Taylor and me taught when this month started. It was, like this talk, organized around a series of speculations. And last week, I found something like a retrospective key to what we tried for in that workshop, or I think so, a key that led me to construe the popular front out of Marina's gaps in my paper today. And I found it in Talal Assad's other kind of half-brilliant book, Secular Translations. It speaks both to our isolation. Yay! Thank you. Sorry. Sorry, I forgot that. Thank you. It speaks both to our isolation and to the means of our communion. And here is Assad. Bless you. T.S. Eliot had claimed in 1921 that the separation of thought from feeling, for which he coined the term dissociation of sensibility, first emerged in England in the poetry of the late 17th century and thus facilitated the process of secularization. Typical of the best of those later called metaphysical poets, so the ones before, writes Eliot, was the direct sensuous apprehension of thought or a recreation of thought into feeling. Ha, no? I love that quote. Colonization, of secularization, of alienation, of capitalization. So the popular front of senses needs our desecularization into communion, and decapitalization is our key. And the popular front of senses needs our decolonization into communion, and disalienation is the key. So our dissociation, the making of our modern self as a gap, it places synthesis exactly where Marina found it, and that is everywhere. Not incidentally, but necessarily. Not re-enchantment, that's just another void, but oozing senses, the popular front of our bad options. J.K. Carter calls this the anarchy of black religion, Bloch calls it expressionism, Lucas calls it realism, Marina calls this infrastructural critique, a materialism that originates within the dissociation of our sensibilities, that needs a popular front of senses to have the there the word is again, weather vane, not blow us apart. The speculative trapdoor Marina built into her sense of infrastructure allows us to repose the question of the popular front, in my view. The attempt to originate revolutionary senses out of compromised forms, like all forms, but like the Mishara Marva was speaking of, the dust Natasha touched, the entropy Roseanne shape, the habit reconstruction that Taylor metabolized, Maria's drawings, Kerstin's and Angela's trains, like I can go on. I made a list of like what happened today, but I will stop. But you get where I'm heading. In an effort to render them revolutionary through their communization across the board. The Popular Front originally was a Stalinist infrastructure dedicated to generating affirmatively non-identical forms within fascism, like a textbook alliance of bad options. But they dissociated, they thickened, they congealed, and cannot be dropped. Nothing can. Not now. That's it.
Well, yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Roseanne and Danny, and everybody who has organized this. It feels very special to be here. Also Alexi for the introduction, and Lana Segobarty, Danny, and Kerstin for editing Marina's last book, which is really amazing, and actually it has been really incredible to be able to read through it also in a loop and constantly find new things. I met Marina in 2002 around that in London, around the Mute magazine, and it was a scene that was very interesting and very full of characters, and the dynamics were not always easy, but Marina was always very cool. It was like really anti-sectarian and very, very welcoming, and this is something that I really appreciate from her. Repetitions. I think you've seen this quote before, and in fact, Kerstin did have the whole footnote, so yeah, much more serious than what anyway. But talking about gaps, I think this quote is really amazing. So the appearance, the talk is called Noise in the Gaps, and it begins with a quote by Marina. The appearance of spaces and openings versus the need to present a solid, impermeable front is a recurring theme in the analysis of the relation between gender normativity and political reaction. Klaus Tebeleit, Singular's book, Male Fantasies, 1977-78, spelled out the thesis as he read the journals and propaganda of the pre-World War II of German fascist militias, with the horror of fluids, filth, and communist women. And more recently, I think, well, you read it before, but anyway. What to say about this quote? This quote sums up the fascist reaction that is happening nowadays to the growing uncertainty of our times. How to present whole selves and coherent worlds within a disintegrating entropic reality. Marina has developed a powerful response to this question through infrastructural critique. For her, this is not a matter of epistemic regulation and intellectual hygiene, but rather a kind of unfreezing of the fast fix, one that can also happen within collective processes of debate, education, organizing, and struggle. And this approach is further developed through her explorations on non-identity thinking, entropy, and self-abolition. In this presentation, I propose to examine how noise relates to these processes and how it might be understood as that which intervenes in and destabilizes the clauses produced by naturalization and reification. Such approach, such an understanding of noise can enable a disentanglement of both false totalizations concerning capital's unbounded power and the fascist impulses that seek to renaturalize categories such as gender, race, family, and the nation state. Yet noise has also been mobilized as a vector for ignorance and uncertainty. The central question then is how agency might be constituted within and through the ongoing social noise, how it might be oriented towards the production of conditions of possibility for a transformative reorganization of the world. Okay, so let's start by showing the gaps in capitalist totality. So this is a workshop that we did in Bilbao, setting up the context. Bilbao, November 2014, Abolishing Capitalist Totality. In 2014, together with Lotte Negarty, I organized a workshop entitled What is to be done and the Real Subsumption at Bulego A, an art space in Bilbao. The invited guests were Federico Corriente, Anthony Alves, Rob Lucas, and Zoe Sutherland from EndNotes, and Dimitra Kotosa, Marina, and Ray Brasier. And I'll go with the intrinsic questions that came out of this workshop, because then in hindsight, I realized that it was quite important for a number of us, including Marina. So to do a very harsh recapitulation, the question of real subsumption has been central to debates within the ultra-left and the communization currents over the recent decades. particularly in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. It concerns how life and labor are incorporated into capital. While Marx understood subsumption as, while Kant understood subsumption as the act of bringing particular under a universal concept, Marx redefined it materially to describe how living labor becomes subordinated to capital. He distinguished between formal subsumption, where capital imposes the wage relation on pre-existing forms of production, like farming, and real subsumption, where production itself is organized around the various extraction of surplus value through the incorporation of scientific and technological means. Various communist currents, from the Italian autonomist of the social factory to groups like Negation and Théorie communiste, interpreted real subsumption as the total incorporation of life under capital. But this raises the problem of whether to understand this subsumption historically as a complete phase or logically as an ongoing dynamic of domination that risks ontologizing value. Communization emerged as a response to these conditions, as an immanent form of revolution without program or transition, as aimed at the self-abolition of class relations and the destruction of the categories that reproduce capital, state, property, money, and the worker as such. And the question of self-abolition brought a paradox that Ray Brassier pointed out in a text, and this paradox is a headfuck. It comes from a philosopher, but it posed very, very concrete, difficult questions and challenges. So, this is the paradox. If we are constituted by the class relation that we have to supersede, then the supersession of this relation is also the overcoming of the agent of the supersession, and therefore the cancelling of the supersession and the reinstallment of the we. Since we have no position apart from the class relation, we are nothing outside of it. But then the moment of the abolition of this relation is also that of the abolition of its abolition. Okay. Marina already started to problematize this paradox of self-abolition by bringing different perspectives on abolition from radical feminism and Black studies. The debates in the workshop in its aftermath were intense. What constitutes a logical conception of self-abolition? How is it grounded in concrete experience? And who is the subject, or who the subject of self-abolition might be? Some crude interpretations of real subsumption risk leading to false totalizations, abstract forms of negations, or an almost messianic anticipation of the revolution that borders on impotent fatalism. So out of this workshop, a few alternatives from this totalizing view emerged. For example, for Marina, in her contribution, and this is a book that it came out of the workshop, and in fact, it was thanks to Marina that the book is happening, because after this workshop, I had like a hangover for a year, and I didn't think about it. And then Marina asked me, weren't we supposed to do this publication? So we've been 10 years on the making of this publication, and it will come out next year with minor compositions. And in this book, Marina has the contribution, Procedures of Abolition and Several Paradoxes They Throw Up. And in this workshop, and in this text, she problematizes in an incredibly sharp way the notion that real subsumption entails the total incorporation of life under capital. For her, the premise of total real subsumption, in which capital and life appears wholly coextensive, functions as a false problem, a vacuous tautology that neutralizes contradiction and recodes critique as contemplative idealism, the ideological comfort of much contemporary art and activism. In this text, endnotes proposed, in the workshop and then in the book, endnotes proposed a different answer in regards to the totalizing views of the notion of subsumption. and is to look at the specific material and logistical processes through which this subsumption is constituted. In a later text, in error, it had different phases, this text, and it was written through a number of years. They write that in engineer, the error marks the discrepancy between intended function and actual outcome, the point where means fail to achieve projected ends. An error thus delineates negatively the boundaries of what is practically possible within a given field of action or set of affordances. My own interest lies in examining what effects of these infrastructures exert upon us, on our modes of perception, relation, and the very constitution of subjectivity. In what follows, I will address these forms of abstraction that produce highly concrete effects. Specifically, I will discuss the feedback circuit between infrastructures and subjectivity, the way in which material systems of mediation shape, constrain, and enable our capacities for thought and action, and the noise and the reaction that it produces. I, like Marina, I'm part of different collectives, and one of them is Noise Research Union. And with different people, we are kind of trying to look at noise from different perspectives. This collective is made with Sonia de Jager, Inigo Wilkins, Cecil Malaspina, Miguel Prado, Martina Raponi, and now recently Patricia Reed. And we try to work through noise, through diagrams, like the complexities of noise in its different forms. So, social noise. What is the fascist fear of noise, of the gap? This has to do with the inner chaos of the terror emerging from the dissolution of self. For the philosopher Cecil Malaspina, who is part of the group, noise is not just a state of confusion and indecision. Noise is also amplified by the panic attempt to redraw the boundaries of the sense of self. To regain the sense of self as first object of cognition, thereby, becomes the precondition to reasserting its relationship with other objects of cognition. At stake, in other words, are not the noises we perceive, but the noise of cognition constituting itself against the always looming crisis of its dissolution. Noise lies at the core of cognition insofar as it represents what the concept cannot fully appropriate from the object. A point that we will explore further in relation to non-identity thinking. Noise breaks through closures and gaplessness, and is feared by the fascists precisely because it undermines the supposed naturalness of their assumptions. If you don't have a clear idea of who you are less likely to dominate others. Today, the noise from above, generated by socioeconomic exchange, intervenes in the noise from below, reshaping our inner models through hormone hacking, as digital platforms exploit our brain reward system for profit. In response to this biohacking and to increasingly excruciating conditions, a catastrophic reaction emerges, a withdrawal into psychic and bodily closure. Drawing on Kurt Goldstein's observation of cell-shocked soldiers, Cecil Malaspina describes this reaction as an inability to cope with ordinary stimuli, producing persistent anxiety and panic. I think this really relates to Klaus Tebelleit's The Panic of the Gaplessness. So for Klaus Tebeleit, the corporate panzer, the body armor, the concept that he developed, that the fascist had, becomes both defense and identity, the fascist I as an impenetrable surface. This dynamic persists today at the level of the states, from the genocidal colonial project of Israel to NATO militarized demands. And in the diagrams that we are making, we are representing the catastrophic reaction with the porcupine. So when a lot of contingency comes, then there is this porcupine who closes itself. And then when things are a bit more, feels a bit safer, it can allow a bit of entropy to come in. Okay. So similarly to the gaplessness of fascism mentioned above, the catastrophic reaction produces a state of total enclosure. However, attempts to enclose oneself only amplify the noise. I will argue that similarly to the shock experience in the aftermath of the brutalities of the First World War and the effects of industrial weaponry, we now find ourselves amid the dissolution of the modern subject and the assumptions that have been central to it, like autonomy, individual freedom, and an abstract universal idea of the human, which are increasingly revealed as extremely partial. This, in conjunction with technological advancements that accelerate the dissolution of selfhood by profiting from its disintegration, generates a situation marked by the general catastrophic reaction, a perversive sense of enclosure. Opening up unsanitary gaps. This sentence comes from Marina, and I really love it. Where new knowledge can come in, continues. So what are these gaps? What are they made out of? In my book, Social Dissonance, I argue that the sense of self is shaped by two intertwined forms of determination that transverse us through impersonal processes. An alienation from above, producing spectral objectivity, and an alienation from below, producing phantom subjectivity. The first corresponds to the Marxist subject inversion, in which our subjective capacities are objectified through commodification, while objects like money acquire subjective agency. The dead seizes the living, as Brasier puts it. The second operates at the neurocomputational level, where the brain cell model generates the illusion of a stable identity. Following Thomas Metzinger, what we take to be the self is merely a representational process, intermittently active and fundamentally unstable. Together, this is to say that he also says that it is only a third of our time that this self-model is activated, which I think is quite important. Together, these two forms of reification structure reality and condition our experience of subjectivity under capital. Not only these two, but I think these two are important. However, this phantom subjectivity is not only merely the result of a projection taking place in our brains, nor the gap constitutive division or lack that defines the subject in the psychoanalytic realm. It stems from a particular understanding of how the subject relates to the individual in capitalist modernity. Just as the commodity appears to possess clear boundaries and prices, the self, understood as a subject endowed with agency, that has agency, also presents itself as having a sharply delimited contour. But as different thinkers and many people have done, including Sylvia Winter in her radical critique of the modern understanding of the human, or psychoanalysis, and other critical currents have shown, this apparent solidity is illusory. To speak of phantom subjectivity is not to abstract specific lives into a general form of abjection. As Marina clearly explains through her engagement with Black radical thought, from Sairija Harman, who traces how the logics of the structures of slavery persist in racial capitalism, incarceration, sexual violence, and the policing of Black life, to Fred Moten, for whom the slaves figures as the presupposition of an object never permitted to be subjecthood, and to Frank Wilderson III's ontology of Black suffering, and his claims that this, that is irreconcilable, the Black suffering. So, therefore, this world we might end, even though, as Hannah Black pointed out, she had a critique to the ontologization of Black suffering. One encounters divergent yet convergent articulations, some more overtly violent than others, on the constitutive brutality of capitalist exploitation and its entanglement with race, gender, disability, and other determinations. So this is not to fall on theories of absolute subsumption, where we are merely a function of the capital automate subject. The capital the capital's automatic subject. Phantom subjectivity still bears material and organic casualties of the unconscious, of our need to sleep, the impossibility of maintaining a constantly activated self-model, and increasing problems with mental health, all of which remind us that there are gaps and thresholds to capital. Yet these gaps are not sufficient to be described as agency, insofar as they are not easily identifiable or mobilized towards a concrete form of antagonism. So after the workshop in Bilbao, we did another workshop in Warsaw. And so this is the book that it will get published. And I guess after the talk from this morning, I think I have to say that we put this title because we basically previously have the title of What is to be done under real subsumption, and we painfully became aware of its lack of being attractive. So we tried to make something a bit more attractive, and also to try to connect to different theories of abolition that have been happening in the last years. I don't know if it will work, but anyway. So in 2019, we did another workshop in which we spent a week in Warsaw with different people, including Marina, Anthony Als, and Pavel Nocowski. We organized this, and we spent a whole week trying to basically work through the material that we have gathered so far and make sense out of it. So at the end of this week, we were taking notes, as you see here there, and we made a score that we performed the last day. And what I find very interesting about the video that I'm going to play is how Marina was already, the first 10 minutes we were supposed to be representing that we are living. And Marina, I just started to basically deal with the infrastructure of the space and play with it very, yeah, you will see. But I thought it was like, oh, wow. I think there is, I think you can see her playfulness and humor, but also sharpness. And this is the last section of the talk, so hopefully it will not be long. So, self-abolition as activated negativity. As a response to some of the questions that came up in the Bilbao workshop, specifically regarding the paradox of abolition, Marina wrote in an interview with Julia Calver and Mira Matar in 2016. Activated negativity comes from thinking how self-abolition can be grounded in some kind of material context, and how it can be determinate rather than an abstract prescription. A process of self-abolition is already underway. The liberal conception of the autonomous self-possessed individual is disintegrating into something more fluid, machinic, and perverse. Unconscious forms of abolition manifest in contemporary behaviors and online subcultures. For example, brain rot, bed rotting, Coomerism, gooning, edging, symptomatic gestures of withdrawal, exhaustion, and overstimulation, specifically among the young. These behaviors reveal not merely a lack of motivation, but a deeper sense of collapse of the very coordinate of desire and subjectivity that liberal capitalism once presupposed. The machinic feedback loops of pleasure, fatigue, and distraction are an expression of self-consumption of phantom subjectivity that does not know where to go. I think this phantom subjectivity has something of a zombie-like. It's like the zombies of history. A project of self-abolition will need to engage within the process of noise to redirect them to propose different kinds of boundaries without presupposing any fixed notion of the subject-object relationship. It must grasp this relationship not from an abstract ideal of white universality, but from within the material and differential conditions that it produces, that produce it. Okay. Over the years, I have been trying to think about how it might be possible to share this social negation, this social abjection, with this social noise through what could be described as an open form, an open source negativity. A collective effort to make sense of our social determination by exploring the codes that shape our conduct and self-conception, but also the noises that transgress these determinations. Understanding the complex structural dynamics of alienation seems to me a necessary preliminary step towards a justice of non-equivalent and non-exchangeable agents, capable of recognizing and exercising their social potential. There is a growing malaise that emerges from the impossibility of being a subject within the capacity to act within capitalism. This is a kind of social noise, difficult to define in general terms, yet increasingly tangible when observed concretely. These moments, in which a coherent idea of selfhood cannot be realized, are what I have called social dissonance, a structural form of cognitive dissonance rooted in the contradiction between the individual as a subject and its impossibility of realization. This contradiction lies between the abstract values of democracy, equality, and individual freedom and their concrete materialization in exploitation and freedom and the destruction of the planet. This social... There is so much negativity produced in this world. Could it be possible to take concrete... How can we take... Well, could it be possible to take the concrete negative effects of what Marina calls activated negativity and collectivize them to push them not only against the fascist, gapless body, but also towards phantom subjectivity? To explore the noise in the gaps means to attend to the porosity of phantom subjectivity, its deficiencies, entropic processes, and leakages, and to capture them in order to collectivize them. As opposition to kind of not let capital to make surplus value out of this noise. In these times, it is necessary to produce a communization of this noise to deal with this malaise, an immanent form of negativity that, through its very potency, comes to understand itself as that is made out of our own making, as that which we reproduce through and as noise. Yet to do this under these conditions is in this extreme adversity, is not easy. It's not easy to open up. For these very reasons, we need a specific concrete and material tools to engage with the noise in the gaps. And I think infrastructural critique is one of these tools. And now to end up, I will try to answer very briefly, what do I think infrastructural critique is? Now, at least. I will say it is an exploration of the concrete forms and determinations through which capitalism shapes material reality and reproduces, what Marina said, vectors of objective and subjective determination by race, class, gender, and so forth, while also attending to the gaps, errors, and affordances that emerge within it, points of activated negativity through which we can intervene. By tracing both the connections and the fractures that constitute infrastructures, we open up the possibility of generating forms of solidarity from their negative effects and contradictions. Through such a work, we can begin to move towards the abolition of phantom subjectivity and the production of other ways of being together, ways that do not position us as subjects of capital. And I would like to now play something which I'm sure basically Marina will really enjoy it, because she was a fan of Lisa Crystal Carver, and she had this band called Sack Dog, and so I would like to play this track as to end up as for Marina.
Well, thank you very much, both Kerstin and Mattin, for these presentations. a lot to think about, and I think, you know, it's okay. Well, I've given myself the gap that I needed in order to to know how to start this conversation, which I think, I mean, maybe we could start with what I take to be is the shared diagnosis that operates maybe in both of the papers, which would be a sort of, let's say, a loose definition of fascism as a kind of fantasy of gaplessness. And I see both of the papers as attempts to sort of want to mobilize this distinction that Marina introduces between the gap and the void. And if I understand it correctly, it's a sort of, on the one hand, it's a critique of, you could say in general, of a kind of reifying tendency of negativity, or the tendency to reify negativity. And this is what that distinction, for me at least, you know, crystallizes. That the void, we could say, is, you know, serves as an instance of reified negativity. And that both of the papers are mobilizing the movement of the gap as being a way of thinking the negative without, you know, reinstalling it within an instance either of, you know, total negativity, you know, as you were saying, with in terms of real subsumption, the tendency is to then position the subject as negative, but as precisely a negativity that is definitively included within capital, allowing no gaps within it. So maybe we could begin with this starting point, and then we might move, you know, maybe I'll just leap ahead and say, I mean, what I saw as a sort of maybe an interesting point of convergence would be, you know, maybe it's a speculative question, but whether in fact how you ended up, Mattin, with this with playing suck dog, which was you know, a beautiful way to end, whether this would not be a kind of, perhaps a kind of paradoxical solution or answer, at least, or proposition to the one that you introduced, Kerstin, with respect to the citation of T.S. Eliot, a way of actually what it might look like to move past the reification of thought and feeling. You know, whether this might be a way to go, because I feel like what was interesting is that maybe the difference between the two papers was a tendency in temporality. I mean, this interesting move that you were making, which would be wanting to reappropriate a counter-modernity, you know, a return to the peasant revolution and seeing gaps within the time register of the movement of capital. And I think with Mattin, you were still thinking with the concept of abolition, an idea of a kind of a futural oriented, let's say, thinking of abolition, or at least that's a question. That might be a point of dialogue to begin the conversation, and then we can open it up.
I think, yeah, when I was listening to you, I guess the question that was coming to mind is both around the relationship between mediation and negativity. You know, like when you talk about the popular front of the senses, yeah, what are the roles of mediation and negativity within this popular front? Because, okay, if we are in the process of disalienation, what is like where do you get there? Like, you know, like what, I mean, because you didn't want to go, you know, you didn't say, you know, it's not re-enchantment. That's, you were very careful, but I was kind of trying to understand what will it be.
Like if I would, like, I mean, I'll first do the stupid answer of like, if I would be able to answer that as an individual author, something would be really wrong. But but I can also do like the structural answer, which is, I mean, I wasn't talking about disalienation so much, and I can like do it a tiny bit now because it's, I mean, where disalienation was a praxis was, for example, like in the work of Francesc Toscano, who Hannah mentioned earlier, and of course Frantz Fanon. I mean, like in English, the word is mostly known through Fanon because it's in the translation of Black Skin, White Masks, but then Fanon has it from institutional psychiatry debates in the 40s in France, which Toscano was like imminent to, and the praxis at Saint-Alban is something they both describe as a praxis of disalienation. And disalienation not so much as a structure of overcoming or of, but of going into alienation and working with the forms of alienation. So it is disalienation is never an individual capacity or an individual feat, but always like a making of communion. And so, and this is why I didn't start from the subject form, because then I'm not against the, I'm not against the subject, but I'm just not so interested in thinking that as a form to start from, to then try with all my forces to get away from it. And that's what I find interesting about this question of disalienation, that it starts from communal form. And I find that is sort of homologous to Marina's understanding of infrastructural critique, because that too doesn't start from an institutional critique that then asks itself how can we become more than one? That's maybe organized or maybe not. But that infrastructural critique doesn't come into being other than in communion. This is why, and maybe so, and I can speak to the secularization thing later, maybe. But I'm really interested. I really loved the song you ended on. And what I found interesting in relation to that piece, to the video you showed before, is the question of standards. Or for me, the question of noise, which I find which I'm into, but the question of noise is one of improvisation as an improvisation of standards. So this is where, for me, the question lies of noise as an individual breaking point or something, or as something that comes in, or the question of in how far can noise be also something that is a question of communion. And for me, that is a question of what are the standards? What standards does it bring out? But maybe that's with another understanding of improv.
Well, I guess my understanding of noise, kind of an improvisation, had shifted from the emphasis from the sonic to the social. And because in improvisation, in fact, in free improvisation, it tries to reject the standards. And the idea is that you almost start from a tabula rasa. But it also implies a liberal conception of the individual, that is, you are able to just express yourself freely. And certainly in this society, that's a dodgy thing to think. So then it's okay, how to think improvisation within the broader constellation. And then, what to think, how noise, how to deal with noise. And I realized that there is so much noise, but it's this, I'm trying to find articulations to talk about this social noise that is already there, these forms of negativity that very often have to deal with them in a private sphere. But, as you were mentioning, that it should be, made, deal collectively in this community. So that I totally, I subscribe to the ideas from Fanon and that you were talking about. But
Well, I mean, I also have many more questions, but we can also open it up to the audience maybe and see. I think there's a question here.
Thanks, Mattin and Kerstin. That was fantastic. Also, in relation to both of your, I like the relation between your presentations. I'm curious about this. This, of course, there is this obvious thread of dissociation between both of your thinking now, and also the sensibility. But I'm trying to be very concrete. So also dissociation is, as we all kind of have, perhaps I think everyone without knowing it or knowing it, are dissociating all the time, and it's also some it's beyond the senses. It's kind of this thing of abandoning sensibility, willingly or not, or abandoning the sense of life and death, as Kerstin spoke about. And it's also this kind of self-alienation of the subject, or kind of the absolute opposite of the Kantian aesthetic subject of sensibility, you know. So I'm curious, so if that's that kind of, you know, double edge of the dissociative kind of practice both of you kind of brought up, that like, just like you said, Kerstin, like this kind of not very interested in the subject, you know, form, because it's, you know, it's this kind of non-form. Then I'm curious, so Mattin, you spoke about this kind of the great installation of installment of the we. I didn't get if it was a citation of Marina or if it was your own formulation, but anyhow, I'm kind of curious how this, like, beyond, you know, the self-alienation of the subject, or like this kind of like beyond sensibility of the senses in this kind of dissociative practice, how does that turn to like the community, like how can that be like how does the we appear? How is the we also perhaps like too solid, or what is the great installment, and how is the kind of collectivization of that which is, you know, beyond identity in this kind of self alienating practice of not sensing, actually, like how do we communize that with which we don't have, or like lost or had to leave behind? Thank you.
Dissociation. I have a more affirmative understanding of dissociation, to be honest. Because, I mean, I would say, in a sense, like if we're like, or like one of the things we all have been speaking about throughout the last days is like the radical historicity of infrastructural critique. And in that vein, I would say that like dissociation is like today's alienation. Like the idea of alienation is very, very stabilized within like a reified subject, and within this isolation, which Taylor spoke of yesterday, like ending on the skin, and the subject doesn't end on the skin, and dissociation sort of accounts for that. And of course, there is like, sadly, the only psychoanalyst I can think of who uses dissociation affirmatively is Jung. That's a shame. But one can also do a bit Laplanche. So it's, I would say, like dissociation is a signature of the present, and it's a pitfall, but at the same time, it is also an opening. And I mean, Maxi Wallenhorst has written about it, of course, in Transaesthetic. Yeah. So I would say like dissociation is something that goes through, and then it also is a question of like, where does it reappear? So that gives me the chance to say, like, the images that have been running through of this show is like me advertising the show that Elisa Erlin curated in the exhibition, one of the two exhibition spaces of the Angewandte at Heiligenkreuzerhof, which is about lesbian and gay organizing in the GDR, and about communion, and very much about like matters of different forms of communion. And now I forgot what I wanted to connect that to, and we'll just stop here.
Yeah, I mean, this communization of the negative or the noise or the social objection or social noise is, yeah, I was trying to, I mean, I was being playful in the sense, like, for example, like this concept of activated negativity, which for Marina was a way to actually concretely deal with the negative effects of living in capital mode production, you know, which is like, and it was an answer to these abstract notions of abolition, you know, it's just like to anchor them. And that's what I found extremely interesting in her work, especially in her latest work, like the importance of being specific. I mean, she said, like, as abstract radicalism is everywhere and should be totally avoided. And I think I you know, I'm trying to, you know, it's like, oh, I actually, I could fall into that critique. So I try to, you know, like find this, okay, let's do it concretely with this, you know, moments of negativity, activated negativity, and understand how they can be, you know, shared, collectivized, or understand how they are part of collective processes, and, you know, what to do about them. Yeah.
Hi, I have a baby. Oh, so there's someone else? I have a very short question. I don't know if this is true, but I read it online, and I want to believe that it's true. So let's just say it is. So I think we don't have hydroreceptors or something like that. Like we can't feel that things are wet. We only know that things are wet by making an assumption based on feeling the temperature of something. So it's like indirect or indirect sensing of wetness through temperature. So I guess I want to think about both of your talks together. What are the indirect senses of this popular front of senses? Like what are they sensing? And the same kind of question for you, but in this shift from the sonic to the social, what are these like collectivized organs of sense? Yeah, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, I guess, yeah, so this concept of social dissonance that I've been developing for, 8 years, it has like a practical, it has an escort that is to be performed. And this is the way in which, you really deal with this social dissonance. You leave them within, but very fast you can really get into them and start to experience them and sense your body, how your body starts to become, you're embarrassed, or, the sense of time becomes slow, and then you start to project on what people might think of you, and like you might sweat, you might, all these things is a way to understand that, okay, there are concrete, specific ways in which we embodied our own kind of projections about ourselves in relationship to others, and the negative, and to explore the negative effects of that within, an embodied situation. So this is what I've been doing for quite some time. Yeah.
So, I mean, on the one hand, like if one looks at like the discussions around materialism around 1900 with somebody like Ernst Mach and Avenarius and then Robert Musil writing and Bogdanov writing, I mean, like the radical empiricism is very much like a question of like, why the fuck are there 5 senses? That does only make sense for what then Simondon writes about, like for like technical objects, for capitalization of senses. So what is the relation between senses? What are other testing measures for senses? How can we hear? Like, I mean, Marian Amarche's work all about exactly that question, which you will know better than I, but like, so, I mean, on the one hand, it's that, like that there is very, like really like an imperial, like also dodgy imperial, like looking at like the 5 senses don't make sense. And then at the same time, for me, like this is one of the parts about my recent like disenchantment with secularization, that there is like there like historical there is a critique of linearity and like our discussion, like our sorry, I do the we, like the discussions we've all been in, and there's a critique of very many categories of modern history, but there's not really a critique of secularism, because like, no, that's the one thing that's good about modernity. And then it's like, well, it's genocidal, and like the Crusades in the 12th centuries weren't exactly fun, so now we're returning to it. What's good about that? Why is that a materialist concept? So of course, this doesn't mean I'm like for like, yay, religion. But then the question, like if we're saying like bad options, like what are we doing with bad options? Then yes, religion, sorry. So secularism. So I think this is why like it needs sort of like a material negativity of secularization, like not an abstract rejection of it, which of course is bullshit, but yeah. And that's this, and that has everything to do, sorry, with the senses. This is why I had the Talal Asad quote, because he writes about secularism being that cut, to say like, no, your senses are now in the immediacy of positivism. Good luck with that one. So, yeah.
Maybe here I can talk about, I mean, Cecil Malaspina has written an amazing text with this notion of material intellect, and it's tracing to the discussions that were happening like in post-Averroes, like within the Islamic philosophy. And there was this discussion between Christian thinkers and Islamic philosophers. So basically, Islamic thinkers were thinking that the thinking was a collective processes, and they had this term material intellect. But then in Christianity, because they had to, there was this need for people to judge whether somebody will have to go to heaven or to hell, they individualized this process, and then it was easier to kind of affirm, to say, okay, you are guilty, you are not guilty. And this process individualization, which was crucial for the seeds of secularization, then you realize, like, wow, it is actually still extremely Christian, and it comes from a very specific understanding, and or not only understanding but relationship to the power economic structures of happening at that time. So for me, that opened up like a different understanding of this process of secularization.
Unfortunately, we have time for 2 more questions. So I think one in the back here and then one in the front.
I think you already started answering a little bit, but from like the previous discussion, I think it was still lingering with me that there was this talking about like hormonal modulation of the body, and then directly talking about that it is part of like the gender, while it's irritating me that because it's a modulation of the sex, not of the gender in the first place. And then again, both of you had this quote from Teveleit, but you went into the abstraction, into the ghostly, and talking like about this abolition of the self, of the ego. And therefore I would be curious about like what's your take on the body, especially like that the death that is always like haunting this conference in a certain way is always a particular death.
Sorry, I'm just thinking about like from where to start. Like first, truth be told, like I used the Teveleit quote because I wanted to quote Danny. So it was just like, yeah, Teveleit said that, but that makes us understand why Danny's argument is great. And I do think, I mean, there's lots which is problematic about the Teveleit book, and like its sense of death would be really one of those things, because this question of in how far. So I mean, one of the things I would say, like for me again, this would be a problem of like how secularization has worked into a normalization of Christian understandings of death as like the infinite purgatory, like the idea of like of a communion through dying, which now is sort of exasperated in the present, so that there is not a relation to death that has a relation to life, that like finitude is within an understanding of the subject as a quasi-automatic subject, within the idea of autopoiesis and so on. Like death is always pushed to the exteriorization, or like death is seen as a form of terror. And so this is like, yeah, this is why, like, for me, this question of like death as another form of exteriorization right now, as a genocidal exteriorization of life right now, becomes very imminently political. And I would say that, like, as an example, because terror was something that was mentioned before, I found somebody who had like a very good, like, whose writing has a very good sense of this, is Asma Abbas, who writes this, like, who in her book writes about the subject of terror is the subject of unrequited love. And that is the subject that needs to be killed, because it's the subject of an unrequited love that is seen as terror. Sorry, that was very...
Yeah, so around the body, and well, I mean, I think I loved yeah, like I mean, I think I don't know if I can do that, but I will try. But I mean, Hannah Black had this quote this morning. It's like, we're already undoing ourselves. Who the fuck are you anyway? And I will kind of apply it to the body. Like, do we know what the body is? I don't know. Certainly, we have to treat them better, but yeah, there are many possibilities that can, or forms of experimentation that one can do with the body. I don't know if that's a helpful answer, but yeah.
Yeah, I thank you for both of the amazing talks. My question would be for both of you, if you mentioned something about a revolution out of compromised forms, and you said something about fascists' desire for heroism, and it made me think of Antonia's concept of courage without heroism. And I was wondering if that correlates with what you said today about scale. And yeah, I was just wondering if you can, if there is any elaboration within like these connections from your side about this.
No, that's the last one.
That, yeah, unfortunately.
You want more?
Absurdly, like listening to your question, I was like anarchism, like my brain was just saying anarchism, which is like but I do believe in that answer, like not because I think like anarchism is the solution, but because I think like the reason why I spoke about GDR art history and showed all those books is A, because you wouldn't find them online if you were a nerd like me. And B, because I think like that kind of, like I read that kind of art history like years ago and was like, oh God, no, Marxism, Leninism really no person, like can't. And now I was rereading and I was like, it makes sense, damn. And so this question, and that I would say has like a lot to do with anarchism and an understanding of how knowledge works within it. That it is a specific connection, and that connection is, for lack of a better word, spiritual. That there is a connection of senses to that kind of art history today, and that one needs to find out why. Like, why is like suddenly Marxist, Leninist, peasant war something good?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be interested to continue on this concept of spiritualism. I mean, a lot of young people are really, really into it, and it's been taken into so many different directions, and some more dodgy than the others. And you know, and it's like I'll be very interested to know more about that. We can continue that. Yeah, thank you.
Well, let's thank Kerstin and Mattin. Thanks.
Nice. Welcome back, everybody. Alberto Toscano is already on the Zoom. Danny will introduce him, please.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Vienna, Alberto. It's great to have you here, even in this slightly attenuated form. So this is the last session, the last full session of this conference in celebration of the life and work of Marina Vishmidt, before we have a longer closing panel discussion. And Alberto is going to speak for about 25 minutes, I think, and then we'll have a relatively short conversation lasting maybe 20 minutes. I've got two bios for Alberto. There's the one that he sent to us, which just says, Alberto Toscano is the author of Late Fascism, Race, Capitalism, and the Politics of Crisis, Verso 2023, and Terms of Disorder, Keywords for an Interregnum, Seagull 2023. He lives in Vancouver. But obviously, there's a lot more to say, and I just want to say a few words before Alberto starts. So I think Alberto is a friend and a comrade of Marina's in practice and in theory. And I want to say something about what I mean by that. So many years ago, 1 million years ago, or 13 years ago, Alberto was one of the examiners for Marina's PhD, which became her first solo authored book, Speculation as a Mode of Production, Forms of Value Subjectivity Between Art and Capital. And a few years after that, Marina began to work at Goldsmiths in London, where at the time Alberto was working as well. And at Goldsmiths, during what sometimes seemed almost unending process of industrial dispute or workers' struggle, Alberto and Marina were comrades in practice for many years on many, sometimes it seemed innumerable picket lines outside of that institution. But they were also, I would say, this is my speculative proposal, comrades in theory in a quite specific way. Alberto's book, Late Fascism, was actually the last book that I talked about with Marina when she was in hospital in Vienna last year. It had just come out then, just a few months before. And that book, which for me is the most useful book about fascism, or the most useful contribution to the fascism debates to have emerged in the last decade, when we have been dealing with fascism again, does a number of things. But one thing it does very clearly is try to build connections between what seem like contrary traditions within and also outside of Marxism. And I think that it does that, first of all, for very obvious political reasons, to make the connection between histories of European fascism, longer histories of colonial domination and violence, and specific histories of white supremacy and racial domination within liberal democracies, as an area within liberal democracies over the last, say, century or two, perhaps. Another reason it builds connections between diverse or contrary, or perhaps even at first glance contradictory traditions of radical thinking and Marxist theory and practice, I think, is to try to recognize the relationship between non-dogmatic alliance building at the level of theory, movement in theory, we could call it, and the actual practical work of building what Kerstin in the last panel called popular fronts against the forces of oppression in the world today. And that vital work, which Alberto, I think, carries on in his writing as a kind of practice of comradeship in theory, for that reason returns us again in a kind of revolution or recursive loop to comradeship in practice. So comradeship of practice and theory. So it's really, I'm really delighted that Alberto can join us to share with us some thoughts, I think, on abolition, which obviously is a topic that's already come up a number of times today. So welcome, Alberto.
Thank you so much, Danny, for the infinitely generous and comradely introduction. I wanted to start with a few lines from a poem, which is really the source of the title of this brief talk. It's a poem by the Italian communist poet Franco Faltini. It's from 1958. In 1966, Angelo Quattocchi and Lucien Ray translated it in the pages of the New Left Review. I guess they used to publish poetry. And the poem goes as follows. It's called Communism. Despite their certainties, despite my doubts, I always wanted this world ended, myself ended too. And it was that exactly which estranged us. My hopes had no point for them. My centralism seemed anarchy to them. As if I wanted more truth, more for me to give them, more for them to give me, thus living, dying thus. I was a communist throughout. I always wanted this world ended. My memories of Marina are always really singular and collective at the same time. And Danny alluded to our many days, freezing our asses off on Lewisham Road, hoping for a trucker to blow the horn of their truck in solidarity, or a passerby to say something kind and encouraging. But I was also thinking, and it does actually relate very much to the theme of infrastructure, and perhaps also to the theme of abolition, that there are also memories that are really woven into a whole set of collective spaces, institutions, groups that were really the fabric of my life and that of many other people in London and beyond, roughly between the 2007-8 credit crunch and the pandemic. Not just the pickets, but the Marxism in Culture seminar, the full unemployment cinema, reading groups that we had, including a great one that Marina was involved in on feminism and the history of philosophy at the Center for Philosophy and Critical Thought at Goldsmiths, the endless herding cats for the historical materialism conferences, the bizarre, red base that Stefano Geri and others created at a business school at Queen Mary, where indeed I examined, or rather discussed, that amazing book by Marina. I don't think you should. I mean, examining comrades seems to be a kind of a bleak term. So it was a dialogue. In any case, I was thinking of that in part when recently I was rereading a passage about infrastructure, or what she terms the infrastructures of feeling, in a very important piece on abolition by Ruthie Gilmore, and it somehow really resonated with precisely that infrastructural or counter-infrastructural or institutional experience that I was just mentioning. And she says the following. She says, "The selection and reselection of ancestors is itself part of the radical process of finding anywhere, if not everywhere, in political practice and analytical habit, lived expressions, including opacities, of unbounded participatory openness. In the material world," she continues, "infrastructure underlies productivity. It speeds some processes and slows down others, setting agendas, producing isolation, enabling cooperation. The infrastructure of feeling is material too, in the sense that ideology becomes material, as do the actions that feelings enable or constrain. The infrastructure of feeling is then consciousness foundation, sturdy but not static, that underlies our capacity to select, to recognize viscerally, no less than prudently, imminent possibility as we select and reselect liberatory lineages." And Marina's infrastructural critique, amongst many other things, including a granular and acute engagement with a whole skein of artists, many of whom I was not and am not yet acquainted with, is also that, right? Is also this formidable process of selection and reselection of liberatory lineages, but also lines of liberation. And in reading it, I was also so struck, and in part, again, this relates to what I was just saying about this kind of singular and collective memory and experience, just about how much a certain emergent or incipient feeling for infrastructure really defined this period for a lot of us. All of the discussions and debates, which obviously continue around logistics, and the pages of other critical spaces and infrastructures and institutions like Mute, which was the context, one of the contexts in which I came to know Marina, or Endnotes, or Viewpoint, and this kind of international of journals, of small but also in many ways huge journals, and yeah, it strikes me that there's something so about this book that really both culminates or in its own way synthesizes, but also opens up this discussion and and this work on infrastructure in ways that I think we will, all need to continue and prolong in the time to come. I found it, in its own way, both hopeful and uncanny that another very good friend and comrade who passed a year to the day after Marina, Joshua Clover, was writing a book called Infrastructure in a Revolution. In fact, if you go to the pages of Oxford Review, you can see his maps, his graphs and diagrams of the struggles around infrastructure, the struggles around circulation, the struggles around pipelines, but also the forms of commune, the commune forms, right, that developed in places like Standing Rock and elsewhere around those battles and those struggles. And in Marina's book, I was really taken by the fact that, in a way that's so much more lucid but also open than many of the debates that had taken place around logistics and infrastructure and how they might or might not relate to abolition and communism, she really sets a kind of horizon of thinking, but really of theoretical praxis or as well, which tries to really move us beyond the manner in which these debates were, often mired in a really limiting conception of the relationship between infrastructure and reproduction, or social reproduction more broadly, but also how they sometimes came to be magnetized not by determinate, by a kind of indeterminate negation, right? By a sort of, millenarian end of the value form, or a purely verbal or theoretical or kind of axiomatic negation of capital. And that, to me, so many of the formulations and so many of the ways in which she elaborates these points in the book are, and I'm sure will continue to prove, really vital. In particular, also for something that it was very close to my own interest, namely the limits of a kind of aesthetics of revelation and abolition, right? The idea that to simply make the exception, or indeed to make the infrastructure visible, to foreground the backstage and the like, was a sufficient political or indeed artistic gesture. There's two passages in that respect that I just wanted to read, because I think they really, demand a kind of, patient but also intransigent prolongation. She says, the moment when reproduction sheds its moral self-evidence, and I think her critique of moralism throughout, I think, is perhaps one of the greatest resources that she left us in this book. The moment where reproduction sheds its moral self-evidence, allowing infrastructural dependencies to be approached beyond the limits of a perspective that, in seeking to make reproduction visible, has sometimes emptied it of its historical and social content, naturalizing it or equating it with life itself. And I think also the shift from reproduction to, or the embedding of the question of reproduction in that of infrastructure, is also a move against the temptations of moralism. Indeed, I would also argue that the abstract negation of capital, much as it thinks of itself as profoundly formalistic and theoretical, is deeply moralist as well. So I actually think it's a twin critique of twin moralisms, the moralism of life and the moralism of abstract negation, that is immensely powerful. And then she continues, and I really, this was the, at least in this reading, this passage, really stuck with me. And again, I guess also reminded me of the Pickets in its own way. Reproduction should make us angry, because there's no reproduction outside the reproduction of the relations of production, i.e. the capital relation, the source of so much death, disability, exhaustion, and exclusion. In spite of their marked differences in form, period, and tone, the work of the artists considered here make it clear that there can be no care revolution without much more fundamental forms of social transformation. Quoting the salient words of Jasmine Gibson in the Journal of Materialist Feminism Lies, there will be no commoning but the commoning of our wrath and liberation. And I think that the puncturing, the undoing of the comforts, right? The comforts of a certain rhetoric, even perhaps a certain metaphysics of care as the other side of the comforts of the abstract and total negation of the value form is really the kind of, dialectical gift of this book. And I was also, really taken, especially in the last chapter, the chapter where she deals with a remarkable degree of theoretical and aesthetic subtlety with the works of Cameron Rowland, the bringing out the infrastructural dimension, right, of the Black radical tradition is such a significant intervention. I was reminding of two discussions that were really significant to me, and that really resonated with Marina's work. One comes from again from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and specifically from the idea that a materialist theory of racialization under capitalist conditions is also a theory of infrastructure, and as a theory of infrastructure, it also sets the terms for what abolition or indeed revolution would be. Gilmore, in fact, I think this is from a piece that is co-written with Craig, writes, "The state's management of racial categories is analogous to the management of highways or ports or telecommunication. Racist ideological and material practices are infrastructure that needs to be updated, upgraded, and modernized periodically. This is what is meant by racialization, and the state itself, not just interests or forces external to the state, is built and enhanced through these practices. Sometimes these practices result in protecting certain racial groups, and other times they result in sacrificing them." And the other moment that really came to mind is from perhaps a somewhat unlikely source, but one that I would recommend you turn to at some point. In the June 19, 1971 issue of the Black Panther Intercommunal News Service, then Minister of Defense of the Black Panther Party, Huey P. Newton, took up the entire issue, which is, I guess, what you can do when you're the Minister of Defense of the Black Panther Party, to write a film review essay, as you would, in the middle of struggles with counterinsurgency and a racial state that was also engaging in genocide in Vietnam, to review Melvin Van Peebles' classic blaxploitation film, Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song. You can find the whole issue online, and indeed, amongst other things, it has a remarkable, visual and captioning complement. But at one point, he writes this, and it really stood out to me. And I've sometimes taught it and taught the text because of this dimension of infrastructure, not as just as the landscape of landscape and materiality of racial capitalism, but also the terms and conditions of its own undoing, whether partial or total. And he talks about the protagonist, Sweetback, and he said, Sweetback had the ability to use the technology of the oppressor in his own interest. He did not become discouraged because he had no car. Van Peebles could have had him steal a car, but instead he had Sweetback use the basic skills of survival with nothing but the things he had learned for surviving the oppressor for so many years on the block. He doesn't have a car, but he rides on the top of a truck, inside the back of another truck, on a freight train. He uses the oppressor's technology, but in his own interest. He also survives by using the system against itself. In another way, he survives the way the Black community has always survived, by using the resources at his command, even though they are not the resources others would use. And I just wanted to, maybe, conclude with some broader thoughts, right, on this nexus of abolition, communism, and infrastructure. About the question of how is capitalism to be undone, which is also to paraphrase and distort Lenin, not maybe the question of what is to be done, but where is it to be done, and what is the character of this undoing. Now, following leitmotif in Marx's and Engels's and others' writings, itself echoing a broader communist discourse that he had not created ex nihilo, that indeed had been created amongst workers and exiles. The major name for this undoing is arguably abolition. This could also be thought of as the content of that form or forms that we might call transition. Trying to define what he would elsewhere call the immutable tables of the communism forged by Marx and Engels, Amedeo Bordiga, for instance, would assert, by contrast with the communist individualism that others have advanced, that the original content of the communist program is the abolition of the individual as economic subject, holder of rights, and actor of human history. He did this while also warning that abolition should not be conceived as an act of will, something that would fly in the face of his demand for, as he put it, a reduction to zero of the individual factor in history. It was in that context that, against what he called the Carlylean specter of historical heroism, Bordiga called for an impersonal party, for an anonymous revolution. This trenchant fidelity to Marxian abolition is, of course, predicated on demarcating it from any Hegelian sublation or overcoming, terms that translate in English one of Marx's words for abolition, Aufhebung. 'Tis in the latter ways that some, like the late French philosopher Lucien Sèvres, had seen it fit to identify a kind of communist dynamic that carries a large quotient of conservation, you could say even of reproduction, and is not reducible to wholesale destruction. Building on his rejection of Lucien Sèvres' arguments, the French thinker Patrick Thoré has provided an imposing philological audit of the Marxian language of abolition, helpfully itemizing abolition's targets. So working through the kind of Marxist corpus, Thoré lists, right, the things that are the object. The things are the relations indeed, or perhaps the infrastructures that are the object of Aufhebung in Marx. In the manifesto alone, we find class antagonism, the scattering of the means of production, bourgeois individuality, independence, and freedom, the family and the exploitation of children by parents, the role of women as mere instruments of production, prostitution, exploitation of man by man, of one nation by another, the town-country distinction, and so on, right? All directly affixed to the question of abolition. Objects of Abschaffung, the term most commonly used for the abolition of slavery in German discourse, certainly in the mid-19th century, are inter alia, feudal property, personal property, nationality, eternal truths, religion, inheritance, and bourgeois relations of production. These negations are summed up and crystallized by the abolition of private property, or in Marx's mature lexicon of the capital relation. Against Sèvres' insistence that Aufhebung is far more of a supersession, a conserving negation, or even extension, a dépassement, than a destructive movement, Thoré points out that in French translations, approved by Marx, who knew his French pretty well, Indeed, he even tried to, in his very late days, learn languages far from his mastery: Russian, Persian. Aufhebung was rendered most frequently as suppression, abrogation, or abolition. While in the English, or I should have said those three words that are exactly the same with a French accent, but leaving that aside. While in English ones, check by Engels as abolish, do away, destroy, right? Not supersede, overcome, and so on. And there's, of course, an ampler galaxy of terms that Marx and Marxists drew upon, including dissolution, Auflösung, with its prosaic resonances with Lösung, solution, and its messianic ones with Erlösung, redemption. And the language of abolition was, of course, deeply entangled with that of slavery. Though the use of the slave analogy in Marxism has been rightly the subject of Black radical critique, it is also worth noting not just Marx's passionate investment in American abolitionist politics, but also how an unorthodox Marxist politics was interwoven already in the 19th century with what was called the slave's cause. Abolitionists were prominent in the First International. There were direct links to the movement. Abolitionists translated and published some of the first editions of the Communist Manifesto, and marched in defense and memory of the Paris Commune. The nexus of anti-slavery abolition and the international workers' movement of the abolition of racial domination and the abolition of capital has made itself felt at various junctures, often involving a creative appropriation of mainstream communist discourse and dogma for Black people's liberation projects. In 1930s Alabama, African American sharecroppers could mobilize a communist party as a vehicle for self-organization. This even included a militant translation of its otherwise worst phase, that of the third period sectarianism, class against class, appropriating the Stalinist rhetoric of a new world through Black traditions that emphasize the struggle for survival and the transcendent hope of deliverance. In the domain of culture, the spiritual "give me that old-time religion" was adapted with the new ending, "it was good enough for Lenin, and it's good enough for me." As Aimé Césaire wrote in his 1956 letters to Maurice Thorez, bidding farewell to the French Communist Party, "What I want is that Marxism and communism be placed in the service of Black peoples, and not Black peoples in the service of Marxism and communism," a sentiment that could well be echoed by other subjects in other domains. And I think those histories, those infrastructures of feelings, those selections and reselections of lineages and of lines of liberation are ones that Marina really brought to life in, especially in the discussion of abolition in infrastructural critique. And I think especially in this dialogue and resonance with the infrastructural thematics in a Black radical tradition that is also a communist tradition, they remain really vital resources for us all today. So thank you.
So much, Alberto, for that. I don't have a question exactly. I have something which comes to mind very briefly, and then maybe we have time for just a few questions before we move on to our final panel in the end of this conference. But I was thinking about the question about what is to be done and what is to be undone, and the painfulness of that first question for us, often in the face of too many things to be done for us even really to begin to imagine. The feeling of not being able to answer it maybe feels quite void-like, to use a concept that we've been talking about a lot in the last few hours, and which Marina used regularly to describe a kind of non-relational limit that she was not interested in. Maybe the void is what you try to get to when you try to overcome capitalism by a single act of negation that occurs all at once and which has no relationship to material experience. But I also thought about a line which I'll probably misquote from the, you could maybe say, heretical communist poet Fanny Howe, who died earlier this year, where she's talking about her relationship to poetry and how for many years she had lived with this aspiration to find one word that would sum it all up, and that would be the poem. But the desire for one word obviously always produces psychically a void and then a kind of stasis and depression. And what comes through for me in everything that you have brought out in Marina's thinking and in your own work too is the value of something like the opposite of that. So in your philological approach to abolition, already it turns out abolition isn't one word. It's lots of different words, which we, out of convenience to ourselves, sometimes condense into one. But it's many words in many different languages, and those words themselves have different meanings depending on their context, which is something that Andreas was talking about earlier today. And the spirit, which yet again is a word which came up a little while ago, the spirit of multiplication as a way of approaching the question of what is to be done and what is to be undone seems really central to Marina's way of thinking, to her sticky materialism, as Kerstin described it, or to her refusal to drop things once she'd picked them up, to use Kerstin's phrase again. And I think this idea that you introduced of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's about the multiplicitous selection and reselection, the visceral and prudent selection of ancestors is a very beautiful amplification and elaboration of this tendency in Marina's thinking, now that she is in a way a kind of an ancestor for us. So thank you. That's not a question, but that's just a feeling, perhaps, in response to your very generous contribution. And maybe some others have actual questions now. Maybe just one round.
And thanks, Alberto, for this for the talk. I guess maybe I'm just it's picking up on maybe Danny's comments already, but I was sort of interested in particular this sort of the way in which you wanted to identify, which I think is also when sensed also in Marina's sense of humor, in her in the way in which she approached things, this sort of the kind of the critique of moralism, but also this sort of way in which she sort of really had had no truck with any kind of sanctimonious discourse, that it was this sort of a refusal of a kind of grandstanding, which I think is also part and parcel of this sort of critique of of what you were referring to as a kind of abstract negation, or this sort of desire for an absolute negation, which would be a theoretical negation of the capital social relation, and an embrace, let's say, of the difficult hard labor of actually doing concrete historical work, which doesn't necessarily have the glamour of the large scale sort of apocalyptic theoretical gesture. And maybe if you could just comment on that, which I feel like was a kind of also part and parcel of this nice transition to Huey P. Newton's intervention, with this sort of a commentary on the exploitation film, that the way in which then one can move between these registers, but this is also a film that would be, also, you could say, occupy an interesting zone that is sort of bracketing, what we might expect from a kind of a morally oriented, critical orientation.
No, thank you for that. I mean, one way I was thinking about it was really to wonder what tools, what words, what frameworks we might have to distinguish, right, between what Marina really helpfully identifies, but also criticizes as a kind of reproductive realism, right, which can be a form of cynicism, a form of deflationary pragmatism, and on the other hand, what Newton and the Panthers explicitly, but scores, billions of everyday or subalternized people throughout history have lived as survival pending revolution, right? To use the sort of slogan of the Panthers, so-called survival programs, right? sickle cell anemia screening, children's breakfasts, alternative schools, and the like, right? These, and that's always such that's an exquisitely practical, if deeply intellectual question as well, right? Like, what are the tests, right? Or how do you know, how do you know if you've just created, an enclave for your relative comfort amid apocalypse, or, or a precarious red base from which to build larger solidarities? I mean, in some way, it's only retroactively decidable, right? Like, it will have been the case that, this reading group, like, had an effect, or it will have been the case that, we're not just like homeschooling our, like children of middle-class professionals, but we're actually thinking, et cetera, et cetera. Like, you could come up with like an infinite amount of cases. And that's also, I think, where, for instance, I mean, to go back to the 2010s and Mute and so on, I mean, it was also the parts that I found more interesting in those discussions I was having with Jasper and Joshua and others around logistics and so on, was actually the question that in the end, it does become this kind of practical, very practical question, right? Like, what infrastructures, not made by us, but made unto us, or and so on, are refunctionable or not, right? I mean, and that's also what I find fascinating in reading, like Bordiga's super weird text from the 1950s and so on, where for him it's like, well, it's evident that like there will be no apartment buildings under communism, right? Because this is like, or et cetera, right? I also remember the one time that I met Mike Davis, was weirdly enough after a talk about his car bomb book, where he ended up dragging a bunch of Greek anarchists and randomly me and some other people that he met for drinks at the Tavistock, again, randomly, another space very familiar from HM conferences, that he invited us over with the announcement, does anyone want to drink Perry Anderson's wine? I think everybody pretty much would take that invitation. And it was really funny because, one of these anarchist comrades was interpolating about living off the grid and so on and so on, and he had this really comical answer, which again was about infrastructure. It was like, well, say what you will about Stalinism, but large apartment buildings with central heating are much more ecological than all of you high consuming people trying to like live in single family homes out in the woods and then eventually demanding grids to service you and so on. So in any case, all of these, right, become really like both intellectually and theoretically dense, but also eminently practical questions. And I think even though the material that Marina's working with in infrastructural critique is largely material coming from very recent artistic practice, I think the ways in which she approaches that material are profoundly instructive also if you want to think in a communist abolitionist way about schools or sewer systems or cinemas or airports or whatever, right? And so that's kind of what I think and I think that's also what drew a lot of us to these debates about infrastructure or logistics or other affine terms, was the fact that it was this ability for a kind of totalization that was not purely conceptual, theoretical, or philosophical, but that managed to bridge, profoundly theoretical questions with these, material or practical tests, right? But thank you.
Yep. Thank you very much, Alberto, for the
Go.
input.
It's fine. No, there's one more question over here, I think, but go ahead. Sofia.
I keep it very short, but it's one sentence that you said that touched a nerve. Reproduction should make us angry because of the exhaustion of the social contract, exclusions, and so on. And I'm let's say I'm sticking a little bit in this Marxist analysis about the different divisions of labor, of the sensible, of time, of knowledges, space, and so on and so on. And maybe with a more libertarian turn, I would say. And because also you mentioned like the Greek anarchists and other comrades. So I was wondering if we want to shift the perspective in, because we know like capitalism and feudarchy is a lot of decades and centuries, but still we have also examples of societal organization that worked out many, many centuries ago. And I'm thinking now of the dawn of everything, the David Graeber and Wengrow. So I was wondering if you would like to make a connection with the infrastructural approach, maybe how we can link it also beyond the heavy, let's say, capitalist system that we are living in, that is not either or, but maybe these connections, if you're interested. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot for that. I was just like the past couple of days, and I don't know why I picked it up the past couple of days, but it ended up making sense. I was reading Kristen Ross's book, The Commune Form, and specifically the part, I was thinking about the part about the zone à défendre and the soulèvement de la terre, etc. And I think it is really significant that we don't, and I have been guilty of this very much myself, right? But like that we don't flatten the question of infrastructure to a sort of, the mathematical and dynamic, but also horrifying sublimity of capitalist mega projects, right? So infrastructure is not, just the mega tanker and the mega bassin and the et cetera, right? And I think we can definitely think, especially if we're thinking of infrastructures of a kind of an antagonistic but also liberatory form of reproduction. Also, like you say, of practices and social forms that have not, simply been wiped away by the value form, right? Here in British Columbia, or as the comrades call it, so-called Canada, where I reside, a lot of the blockade movements, a lot of the land defense movements, of course, are related not to some kind of static, ancestral conception of indigenous life forms, but to practices that do have a very different history and longevity, and to infrastructures and to relations, material, artifactual, social, and otherwise. So I think, that is, extremely important. And again, it does become a kind of, this question of a kind of practical, but also ethical, like, test, right? What relation, what relations you build, right? For instance, in trying, and what antagonistic politics you experience in trying to block extractivist projects that might provide labor to a small stratum of your community, which settler colonialism has rendered immiserated and impoverished, and that provide, and this is why also all of these things are very, very conflictual in kind, right? But they're existing at the same time, right? So the political infrastructures of various types of indigenous governance and politics exist at the same time, right? As the ones of the settler colonial state, as the ones of the of fossil capital, and so on. And so I do think it allows for a kind of more, capacious perspective that, that is also truer to like the difficult and like cognitively and theoretically difficult questions, sometimes way more difficult, right, than questions of philosophy or dialectics or in that abstract sense, that people meet on an everyday basis. I mean, Danny really kindly mentioned my book, and after writing, actually, I really realized to my, by way of self-criticism, that actually a lot of, those debates that I draw on about racial characters of fascism that people developed in the 1930s were often really developed out of extremely practical, militant, activist questions, right? I mean, basically out of the questions of, in the case of the debates about racial fascism, about worker sanctions, right? About, how do you create networks of dock workers from the Caribbean to Marseille to West Africa to stop armaments going to fascist Italy as it occupies Ethiopia. And it was out of that, right, in a sense, that thinking through the racial dimensions of fascism, it wasn't like a debate around around a seminar table, or not only, right? And I think that's also really, I think that attention to infrastructure also allows, and to the praxis of infrastructure also allows us to recalibrate our feel for where theory comes from, right? And it often comes anonymously, and then takes the proper names, and the proper names are not by any means insignificant, of C.L.R. James or George Padmore or whoever. But it's also percolates through this, much more anonymous practice, and I think it's important to have a sense of that.
We're 10 minutes over, so what? Maybe we should. Two more questions. Okay, but we take them together, and yeah. And if you can try, everyone can try and just be succinct.
Thank you so much. I'll be very brief. I just brought this up when it was no question. But anyhow, so you mentioned in your talk, like, abolition is the content of the form that we call transition. And then you also said, and it's not an act of will. And that, I mean, I don't think you were thinking or meaning, gender transition, but I was still, curious, because before, when you were not here in the morning, we were talking about this kind of problem, or, perhaps impossibility, or, the tricky thing of discussing gender abolition. And then this formulation of yours, if understood through the lens of trans, would be more like, rather than what to abolish, then it's like how to abolish, and then understanding transition as that practice in which abolition takes place. I don't know, this is not what you're talking about, but I'm curious if that kind of material praxis could, like, how abolition, as you spoke of it, could be understood through that lens. Thanks.
Thanks so much for your talk. I'll try to ask this quickly. I was thinking about this, the debates that you brought up from the 2010s about infrastructure and logistics, where infrastructure emerges as a kind of terrain of struggle and an object of critique, maybe. And I'm just thinking about this shift from infrastructure as maybe a site of critique to infrastructural critique itself as maybe like a reformulation of that. And I was wondering if you had any more remarks about that, kind of what has happened in that period, and how infrastructure itself has not only kind of emerged as, again, like an object in a terrain of politics, but something that has changed or shifted the questions of theory, and how that relates to the questions of practice that you're talking about, where the practical and the theoretical start to merge. And then the other question is about aesthetics, I think, or very kind of broadly about that, because I do think that, especially in infrastructure studies, the very first move is the kind of aesthetics of revealing, as you say. And I'm curious if you could say more about how Marina's work gives us like a different perspective on an infrastructural mode of aesthetics.
Well, those are both really compelling, but also vast questions. I really find I haven't thought with any sort of with any kind of systematic attention to the very interesting and significant homonymy, analogy, articulation, right, between those different modalities and meanings of transition. Of course, there's an enormous amount of very important writing on trans-Marxism and trans-communism that does deal with those questions in ways that I wouldn't be able to do now. But yeah, I guess that there is a sense, I suppose, in which, and I think Marina is also, intervening into some of these debates. I was thinking of those, those essays on gender abolition and endnotes that are quoted in Infrastructural Critique and so on, and just to think what would it be to approach these matters not like where the weight is not on a kind of like logical or metaphysical negation of gender, right? And where it is a matter of relation and also very much collective practices of transition and abolition across all sorts of different modes of life and experience. But yeah, I'll just have to sit with and think of that. Though I suppose there's maybe in terms of other lines of thinking that I'm interested in, I do think that the phobias, right, and the counter-revolutionary or even counter-reformist practices that completely pervade our present, also have to do, right, with like, the idea of fascism as preventive counter-revolution, as Luigi Fabbri, R.P. Dutt, Angela Davis, Herbert Marcuse, and many others pointed, is also about that, right? Is also about certain imaginaries or fantasies and fears of transition and abolition that are preempted, right, with forms of fixation, regimentation, extermination, and so on, right? And so I do think we also have to be attentive to the way in which these issues like occupy the souls of our adversaries, so to speak. The second point I think is, again, I'll have to ruminate more, but I think that is one of the things that I think is really remarkable in Marina's book, and also in the way in which she limbs and atomizes things through the work, for instance, of Cameron Rowland about the legal infrastructures and property infrastructures of slavery and its afterlives, is to think in and through infrastructure rather than about it, right? Like you would think about logistics or about as an object, right? And as an object which can be displayed or made visible or contemplated. And that's that's an extremely vital but also very challenging proposition, right? Because of course, especially when those infrastructures are such a massive curtailment and control over everyday lives, including the thousands of data centers that our overlords now want to build, everywhere from Gaza to the deserts of the American Southwest. It's difficult, right, not to just be both horrified and fascinated and paralyzed, right, by the sight and by the scale, right, of kind of infrastructure. And so I think that I also really appreciate as one of the intuitions, but also the challenges that Marina's book puts to us, right, is not to be trapped in the infrastructure fetish, right, which is sometimes also the fetish of its opponents, of its saboteurs, of its blockaders, and so on, right? Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Thank you so much, Alberto. Thank you for being with us in Vienna. And I guess, yeah, a round of applause for Alberto.